Hey there, this is Erica from Ever Educating, and this channel is teaching tips, tools, ideas, and resources. And today we're talking about backwards design. I mentioned it in an earlier video when talking about creating targets for your students for outcomes, and so I wanted to discuss it in its own video because it's a really popular approach to designing a course. But if you haven't heard of it, it's also very helpful, very valuable approach, so I want to make sure to cover it on this channel. Now, backwards design is simple in that it only has 3 steps. So the first step is outcomes. The first thing you want to do is think about the outcomes of your course. This is why it's called backwards design, because you're designing it from thinking back to front of the course, thinking about week 16 or week 7, week 10, whatever, however long your course is, and then working your way backwards from there. So step 1, outcomes. What should students be able to achieve by the end of your course? So this can be knowledge they should be able to have versus skills they should have, or not versus, but and, right? So what knowledge should they have? What skills should they have? What behaviors should they show by the end of your course? So you want to write those down first, have an idea of what those are. The next step is thinking about assessments. How are you going to prove whether your students achieve those outcomes? You create assessments that will hopefully do so. So these can be formative assessments that happen throughout the semester, or summative ones, something that happens at the end of the semester, or potentially the end of each unit. You can argue that's summative. Some could argue it's formative because it's throughout the semester still. But basically here, what assessments are you going to use to see if your students have achieved the outcomes you decided upon for your course? And the third step of designing the course is then the actual lessons. So what lectures are you going to create? What materials are you going to create? Videos, text-based, infographics, all of it, right? So the actual lesson planning happens last, after you know the outcomes and the assessments that you want to do or achieve in your course. So that's backwards design in a really concise nutshell. But again, as part of this video, I wanted to go over an example of actually doing this 3-step process. But before we get to that, one thing to keep in mind is if you're someone who potentially has the power to teach more than one course in a series of courses, then you might want to consider backwards design on a higher level, not just within a course. So for example, if maybe you are teaching a specialty and there's 5 courses in that specialty and you teach all of them, then you might want to think about, okay, course 5 first. What is the outcome of this specialization, this series? Now that you know that, right, now you design, okay, well, what's going to happen in course 5, course 4, course 3, course 2, course 1 to get to that point. And then once you know that, now you go into the specific courses. Okay, in this course, how am I going to be assessing these outcomes? How am I going to be teaching to get to this point of achieving this for students? In course 4, same thing. What's the smaller outcome of this course? How are we going to assess that? How are we going to teach that? What's the smaller outcomes of course 3, and so on. So that's something to consider as well if you're someone who has the experience of teaching multiple courses. You might think about the last course and then working your way forward to the first. So that way, hopefully there's no gaps in the knowledge students are gaining between courses. If maybe it's 1 or 2 of you, 3 of you, right? It might be great to kind of, hey, can we meet and discuss how we're each designing our courses to make sure, again, that there's a smooth flow between them. That can be really helpful to students as well if you can collaborate in that way. It's not always possible when you come in, teach, and leave, but if you do have that ability, then collaboration could be really great here as well. So something to keep in mind on a higher level of backward designing a program, for example, versus a course. Something else to consider, just as a kind of an aside, you might have an external assessment to keep in mind as well. So maybe your course, the outcome for your course itself is one thing, but maybe there's also, okay, well, once your course ends, they have to take this exam that's part of the major, right? It's not for your course, it's in order, let's say, passing the bar, right, would be an example of this. So there might be an external assessment that you get to keep in mind as well when you're doing your backwards design. So potentially not, maybe you're one of the very early courses, but even those courses, I would assume, have connections to that final assessment before they are certified or able to do whatever career that your students are trying to reach. So that's something to keep in mind as well. It's not just assessments you curate for your own course, but an assessment might be the final end game. And in that case, you want to keep the design of that assessment in mind when creating your own course. Because it might be, well, that exam, maybe it's essay heavy. Okay, well, there should be at least one essay as an assessment in my course for them to practice their writing, right? Maybe it's 500 multiple choice questions. All right, let's get them to practice the types of multiple choice questions they'll see there in my course as well. Not all assessments will be multiple choice, but at least have that practice in your course, right? So keep that in mind if there's an external assessment that's really important for your program. Let's take a look at a course that I taught for a few years. And this is a literary narrative course, an undergrad course, general education. And the catalog description is critical reading and analysis of a variety of literary narratives that reflect on human experience. So nice and vague, letting me have a lot of room for deciding what are the outcomes, what are the books that we're going to be studying, how I'm going to approach this particular course. There's a lot of room, flexibility here for creativity, so it's a good example for backwards design. So the first step, again, outcomes. What are the desired results that you want students to achieve? So in this case, definitely critical reading skills and analytical writing skills, because that's straight from the statement below. Specifically MLA, because that's what we use for our citation style in English. But then again, that's still pretty vague. So what specifically do I want students to be able to do? I came up with 3 outcomes. Be able to critically engage with literary narratives in verbal and written form. Be able to analyze literary narratives using literary concepts and terminology. And be able to articulate what they've learned about literary narratives and their connection to the human experience. So here are 3 things I can focus on when thinking of the next 2 steps. So thinking about assessments, well, how are we going to know if students are achieving these outcomes? Well, there's different approaches you can take. I'm not a big reading quiz person, but sometimes they're just needed. It can be a way to help push students to read if you have a lot of students who aren't doing the reading, and then your discussions are very hard to actually have because 3 of your 20 students have read something. So you might need to do reading quizzes, but it's not really the main one I do when I do assessments. I'll link a video below about how I design my quizzes when I do them. But for the most part, informal analysis writing is something that I use a lot, right? So it gets them to practice that skill because that's one of the main outcomes. And so I usually do this by having small analysis posts they do, and they post online. And then a literary analysis paper. So a longer piece of writing is very common as an assessment tool in literature courses, and so this is no exception. But I'm not someone who just has papers, 3 papers, and that's how I grade them. No, it's at least one of the assignments, but not all of them. And so then a group facilitation project. Well, this one I thought of because of this 3rd outcome, right? Be able to articulate what they've learned about literary narratives and their connection to the human experience. Reading is not an isolated experience. I want to make sure that they're discussing how they're viewing the piece of work, the piece of fiction or nonfiction, and get the views of others as well. So using their peers to be able to learn more and to really dig deeper into what they're reading. And then coming up with a way together to facilitate a discussion on the work that we're reading. So I always do this kind of project. It tends to work out pretty well in my classes. And so that's another one there, tied heavily to that 3rd one specifically. And then a creative project, which I have a little asterisk next to. Sometimes I just save this for an extra credit activity, but sometimes I do it as one of the main assessments. I think that having them do something creative can really help them see literature in new ways, and it also can put them into the headspace and the creative space and the skill space of authors or artists. So there are times when I have it as one of the main projects as well. So here are a few ideas that can give me evidence of whether or not they're achieving these outcomes. And finally, lessons. So how you're going to plan how to actually help them achieve these outcomes. And that's where obviously this was too little of a space to write all the ideas here, but terminology lectures, so introducing them to different terms, to different concepts. I probably use slide decks for that and have lectures. Application lectures are actually having them apply what they've learned. Okay, I've taught you these terms, I've taught you, and we discussed these concepts. Now let's start applying them. Here's a scenario
what term does this scenario apply to? Here's this example of a poem. Tell me 3 concepts that you can see this poem discussing, and so on. So having them practice applying their analysis skills, their critical reading skills to whatever text that we're reading. Small group discussions are obviously a huge part of literature courses, both verbal and online. Whole class discussions where I facilitate a discussion using the various questions. There's, in between these, a think, pair, share activity, which is also very common and is linked in one of the videos below, ideas for discussions in literature classes. I think the think, pair, share is a great one for that. Individual writing practice, so they can have some time in the classroom to practice writing, and they can ask me questions as they need to, rather than always doing it for homework. And on the bottom here, just a quick list, have them read online articles, resources that I made for them, supplementary videos that I make or that I find online. So in this last part, it's okay, now actually let's start creating the content for the course. Now, if you want to discuss your own design of your course with me one-on-one, I'll link my consult call service below. But this is an example of how I can use backwards design to design a course.
If you found this video helpful, click like to let me know. And if you have any questions, you can go ahead and comment as well. I'll link some videos that relate to this as far as designing different weeks of a course, or even just thinking about lesson planning more generally, and that video that I mentioned earlier on about the targeting for your students.